The storm did not arrive suddenly. It stalked the land, patient and inevitable, the way grief does when it knows you cannot outrun it. He felt it in his bones hours before the sky closed, a pressure behind the eyes, a tightening in the chest that had nothing to do with cold. By the time the wind began to scream, he was already too far from anywhere he could name as safe. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. He had come north chasing quiet, believing silence might be a remedy for what he had lost, though he never said that aloud, because saying it would make it sound foolish and small. The map he carried was old and soft at the folds, a thing he trusted because it belonged to someone who had once survived this coast, and because trusting it spared him from admitting he was afraid. Each step sank into snow that groaned under his weight, the sound sharp and brittle like ice cracking in a glass. And with every breath his lungs burned as if the air itself were punishing him for being here uninvited. The land was not empty, no matter how empty it looked, to a man raised among walls and engines and voices that never truly stopped. It watched him with a calm indifference that felt almost merciful, allowing him to pass without acknowledgement, offering no promise and no threat, only endurance. The horizon flattened into white and steel, the sky lowering until it seemed he could touch it if he reached up, and in that closeness, he felt the old ache return, the one that came from surviving when someone else did not. He had been walking for hours when he saw her, though at first he did not understand what he was seeing. A shape moved against the wind with a steadiness that defied the chaos around it, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs and layered hides that bore the marks of use rather than display. She did not hurry, and she did not look at him immediately, and that lack of urgency unsettled him more than the storm itself. When she finally turned, her face was stark and composed, dark eyes steady beneath lashes heavy with frozen snow, her breath a measured plume that did not waver. She was larger than him, not in a way that demanded fear, but in a way that made him aware of his own fragility, his tired limbs and shaking hands, his dependence on chance. The wind tore at her clothing, but she stood as if rooted to the ground, as if she belonged to the storm rather than endured it. He tried to speak, to explain himself, to offer the clumsy politeness of a stranger who knows he is out of place, but the words froze before they reached his mouth. His tongue felt thick, his jaw stiff, and all that emerged was a sound that the wind stole and scattered. She watched him struggle without impatience, her expression unchanged, as though she had seen this before and knew how it ended if nothing intervened. Without ceremony, she gestured for him to follow, a single motion of her arm that cut through the air with quiet authority. He hesitated only long enough to feel the cold seep deeper into his boots, to recognize that hesitation here was not caution, but surrender. When he moved, he did so carefully, matching her pace, his steps clumsy beside her sure-footed progress across terrain that offered no clear path. They reached a low structure half buried in snow, stone, and driftwood pressed together by years of wind and repair, its entrance shielded by stacked blocks of ice that deflected the worst of the gale. Inside, the air was dim and close, warmed by a small fire that snapped and hissed as moisture met flame, the smell of smoke and animal fat grounding him in a way he had not expected. His hand shook violently now that he had stopped moving, the delayed reaction of a body that had been pushed too far. She moved with practiced efficiency, feeding the fire, adjusting the shelter's coverings, ensuring the wind could not steal their heat, her movements economical and precise. There was no wasted effort, no flourish, only the quiet competence of someone who had learned survival not as a theory but as a daily negotiation. When she finally looked at him again, it was not with curiosity but with assessment, as if she were reading a map written in the way he stood, the way he held his shoulders as though bracing for impact. He sat where she indicated, close enough to the fire to feel its warmth without risking burns, the sensation almost painful in its intensity after so much cold. As his breathing slowed, the storm outside grew louder, the shelter shuddering in response, wood creaking like an old ship at sea. He realized then how thin the line was between endurance and disappearance, how easily the land could erase him if it chose to. She spoke at last, her voice low and even, carrying the weight of certainty rather than threat, words shaped carefully as if they mattered. She told him the storm would last through the night, that travel would be impossible until the wind broke, and that staying alive required stillness as much as strength. There was no invitation in her tone, only fact, and yet he felt something settle in his chest, a loosening he had not allowed himself in years. As the firelight flickered across her face, he saw not menace but resolve, a steadiness forged by loss and responsibility rather than conquest. He understood then that shelter was not merely walls against the wind, but a decision made again and again to protect what was fragile, even when the cost was high. Wrapped in borrowed warmth, listening to the storm rage beyond the stone, he sensed that this night would mark him, though he could not yet say how. The first thing he noticed as his body began to thaw was how loudly it protested being alive. Pins and needles flared through his fingers, then deepened into a slow, bruising ache that made him want to clench his fists and scream just to prove he still could. His boots, stiff with ice, sat near the fire like unfamiliar animals, steaming faintly, and every time the wind slammed the shelter's outer wall, the entire structure answered with a low groan, as if it too were holding its breath and choosing not to break. She watched him without hovering, giving him space the way experienced people do, close enough to intervene, far enough to let dignity survive. In the firelight, her size felt even more pronounced, not exaggerated, simply undeniable. Long limbs built for distance, shoulders shaped by labor, hands that looked capable of tenderness and violence with equal precision. Snow clung to the edges of her hair and melted slowly, leaving thin, dark trails on her cheeks, like quiet tears that did not belong to sadness. He found himself staring, then forced his gaze down, ashamed of how quickly his mind tried to turn awe into distraction. The shelter held traces of other nights, other storms, smoothed stones arranged with intention, dried sinew hanging from a peg, a carved piece of bone tucked near the doorway like a marker. None of it felt like decoration. It felt like memory made practical, objects that earned their place by helping someone breathe, eat, endure. He realized the strange comfort of that, because his own life had been filled with things that meant nothing until tragedy forced meaning onto them. When she finally spoke again, it wasn't a question, but it reached him the way a question does, an opening that demanded honesty. "Your hands," she said softly, nodding toward them, and he looked down to see his knuckles still pale, the skin raw where the cold had bitten. She produced a small cloth and a tin of rendered fat, and with a calm, almost impersonal care, she began to work it into his skin, warming his fingers between her palms before applying the salve in slow circles. He should have pulled away. A stranger touching him like that, in a shelter far from anyone who would notice if something went wrong, should have triggered fear. Instead, what rose inside him was something older and more humiliating: relief. Not the relief of being rescued, but the relief of being handled as if he mattered to someone's sense of right and wrong. It unsettled him so deeply that his eyes stung, and he blamed the smoke so she would not see the truth. "Thank you," he managed, voice rough, each word scraping out of his throat like it had to pass through a narrow place first. English came easier than he expected. He had spent time around research stations years ago, long enough to know most people here carried more than one language in their mouths. But he spoke slowly, careful not to sound like he was making demands. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to." The sentence collapsed under its own weight, because he didn't know what he was trying to prove by explaining himself. She looked up, and in her eyes there was no judgment, only a steady patience that felt almost unbearable. "Storm doesn't care what you meant," she replied, and the simplicity of it landed hard. It was not cruelty. It was truth, the kind that cannot be negotiated with. Then, after a pause that made his chest tighten, she added, "But I care what you do next." Those words struck him like a hand on the sternum, firm, grounding, forcing him to sit upright inside himself. For a moment he didn't respond because he wasn't used to being expected to do anything except survive his own thoughts. He had come here to be nobody, to let the world forget him for a while, to drift the way ice drifts until it breaks apart. Her tone made that impossible. It implied continuity, responsibility, a future he had been avoiding. He swallowed and tried again. "My name is Eli," he said, and the name sounded strange in the shelter's small air, like it belonged to a person who still had a place in the world. I was heading to the coast. I thought I could make it before the weather changed." Even as he said it, he knew how naive it sounded. The storm outside answered with a roar, as if mocking the idea that a man could bargain with the sky. She regarded him for a long moment, and when she finally spoke her own name, she did it like an offering that came with conditions. "Akaluk," she said. The sound held weight, consonants shaped like the crunch of snow beneath a boot. "You stay in my shelter tonight. You do not go outside. You do not chase your thoughts into the wind." She said the last part as if she could see the shape of his mind, the way it leaned toward self-punishment, the way it tried to turn pain into proof. Eli stared at the fire and felt a memory rise uninvited. A hospital corridor, painted in a color meant to be soothing, the smell of antiseptic and old coffee, his hands shaking the way they had been shaking earlier, but for a different reason. He saw a door with a small window, a doctor's mouth moving, and the moment he understood that words could fracture a life. He blinked hard, and the image dissolved into smoke. Akaluk noticed the shift in his posture, the way his shoulders pulled inward, as if bracing. She did not ask what he saw. Instead, she reached for a small kettle and poured him something warm. Dark, bitter, alive with heat. He drank, and the liquid burned his throat in a way that made him feel present. The warmth spread slowly through his chest, chasing the numbness back toward the edges. For a while, they sat without speaking, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of listening. Outside, the storm dragged its claws across the shelter, and somewhere beneath the howl there was a deeper sound, the distant, low shifting of ice, like the world rearranging itself. Eli realized that in the quiet between gusts, he could hear the fire, the faint crackle of fat on stone, the soft movement of Akaluk's breath. These small sounds felt intimate, almost sacred because they meant life was still happening. At last she spoke again, and this time her words carried something older than immediate survival. "When the wind is angry," she said, eyes fixed on the doorway, "it tries to make you believe you are alone. It wants you to panic, to run, to waste your strength." She glanced at him, and her gaze was direct enough to feel like a hand turning his face toward the truth. "You came here with a storm already inside you." Eli's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He did not know how to admit that she was right without also admitting what the storm was. Guilt, grief, a single decision that had altered everything. He looked down at his hands again, at the faint sheen of salve on his knuckles, and felt the strange ache of being cared for by someone who did not know his story, yet still treated him as if he could be more than it. Akaluk shifted closer, not close enough to crowd him, just close enough that her presence became undeniable, a barrier against both cold and the darker impulses that wanted to swallow him. In a voice so quiet it almost blended with the fire, she said, "If you sleep, you will dream. If you dream, you will remember. If you remember, you can choose." The words were not mystical, not theatrical. They were the logic of someone who had survived long enough to understand that the mind, like the body, cannot heal while running. Eli felt his throat tighten, and for the first time since he arrived in the north, he allowed himself to imagine something he had refused for years. That survival might be more than punishment. That shelter might be the beginning of a different kind of story. Sleep came to him in fragments at first, thin and brittle, the way ice forms along the edge of open water before it dares to close completely. His body lay still, wrapped in furs that carried the scent of smoke and animal oil, but his mind kept flinching awake, listening for danger that had already been held at bay. Each time he surfaced, the storm was still there, relentless and furious, and each time he realized the shelter still stood, the fire still breathed, and Akaluk remained a solid, unmoving presence across from him. When his breathing finally deepened, the memories he had spent years outrunning caught up to him without ceremony. He was back in a small aluminum boat, the motor coughing unevenly as it cut through gray water under a sky too wide to offer comfort. His brother stood near the bow, laughing at something Eli could no longer remember, and the sound of it pierced him now with a sharpness that made his chest ache even in sleep. The dream did not dramatize the moment that followed. It did not need to. The sudden shift, the imbalance, the splash, the empty space where a body should have been, these details were enough. He woke with a sound stuck in his throat, half breath, half apology, his hands clawing at the furs as if they could pull him back from the past. The fire had burned low, but the shelter was warmer than before, the air thick with the quiet aftermath of survival. Akaluk sat near him, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate strokes, the rhythmic scrape steadying in its repetition. She did not look surprised to see him awake. She had been expecting this moment. For a long time he said nothing, ashamed of the tears he could feel cooling on his cheeks, angry at himself for being so undone by something that had already happened and could not be changed. The storm outside had softened into a constant heavy wind, no longer screaming but still insistent, as if reminding them that endurance was an ongoing agreement rather than a single victory. The ice beneath that wind shifted and settled, making a sound like distant thunder rolled flat. "I didn't save him," Eli said finally, the words escaping before he could stop them, raw and unshaped. His voice cracked, and he did not bother to hide it. "I let go. I thought I could grab him again. I thought the water would give him back." He swallowed hard, his throat burning. It didn't. Akaluk set the blade aside and turned fully toward him, her attention complete and unwavering. She did not interrupt, did not rush him toward absolution or explanation. In her stillness, there was permission, and that permission was heavier than judgment would have been. Eli's shoulders shook as the rest spilled out, how the search lasted hours, how the Coast Guard found nothing, how people told him accidents happen and time would soften the edges. None of that had helped. Time had only made the shape of the loss more familiar, not smaller. When he finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It pressed gently against him, holding the weight of what had been said without collapsing under it. Akaluk nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging not just his words, but the courage it took to release them into the air. "The water does not return what it takes," she said at last, her voice low, shaped by experience rather than comfort. "If it did, none of us would learn how to live with what remains." She rose and moved closer, her steps measured, and knelt beside him so their eyes were level. Up close, he could see fine lines etched by wind and light, marks of a life spent negotiating with elements that did not care about fairness. She reached out and placed a hand flat against his chest, not pressing, not pulling, simply resting there as if to confirm that his heart still worked. The contact was grounding, undeniable, and he felt his breathing begin to steady under her touch. "You think letting go makes you weak," she continued, her gaze steady. "But holding on forever is not strength. It is fear pretending to be loyalty." The words landed with precision, not cruel but exact, and he felt something inside him resist, then slowly yield. He had built an entire identity around that fear, wearing it like penance, believing it kept him connected to the brother he had lost. The shelter creaked as a stronger gust hit, and Akaluk glanced briefly toward the doorway before returning her focus to him. "Out there," she said, gesturing toward the storm. "The ice breaks because it moves. It cracks. It shifts. It makes room for what comes next. The ice that never moves shatters when it is forced." She withdrew her hand and sat back, giving him space to absorb the comparison without feeling cornered. Eli let her words settle, feeling them echo against the truths he had been avoiding. He thought of the years he had spent drifting from job to job, place to place, refusing to anchor himself to anything that might require commitment or risk. He had told himself he was honoring the past, but now he wondered if he had simply been afraid of choosing a future that did not include constant punishment. "I don't know how to be different," he admitted quietly. The confession felt smaller than his earlier outburst, but somehow more dangerous. Admitting pain was one thing. Admitting the desire for change meant admitting responsibility. His eyes met hers, searching for something he could not name. "I don't know who I am without this." Akaluk considered him for a long moment, and when she spoke, there was a softness in her tone that did not diminish its strength. "You are not finished," she said. "The storm outside will end. The one inside you will change shape. Neither asks for permission." She rose and added more fuel to the fire, the flames flaring briefly before settling into a steady burn. "When the light returns, you will choose where to walk." The idea frightened him more than the storm had. Choice meant accountability. It meant the possibility of failing again. But it also meant movement, and movement, he was beginning to understand, was the only way ice survived without shattering. He lay back against the firs, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline of confession, and watched the fire until his eyelids grew heavy. As sleep claimed him again, this time it came deeper, more complete, and the dreams that followed were quieter. The water was still there, vast and cold, but now there was also a shoreline, solid beneath his feet, and the knowledge that standing on it did not mean betrayal. Somewhere beyond the shelter, the wind began to lose its fury, and the ice shifted with a sound that felt less like warning and more like release. Morning did not announce itself with light so much as with a subtle easing of pressure, the kind that only those who have waited through long darkness learn to recognize. The wind loosened its grip in uneven breaths, no longer hammering the shelter, but circling it, testing, reluctant to fully retreat. Eli woke slowly, his body heavy and sore, the deep ache of muscles that had endured too much cold layered with the unfamiliar sensation of having rested without running from his thoughts. The fire still lived, reduced to a low, patient glow that warmed the stones and kept the shelter from surrendering its heat. Akaluk was already awake, her silhouette outlined against the pale gray that filtered through the entrance, her movements deliberate as she prepared for the day. There was no wasted motion in the way she worked, no sign of haste or relief, only the quiet discipline of someone who understood that survival did not end when the storm softened. It merely changed its terms. Eli sat up carefully, feeling the pull in his joints, the stiffness that reminded him how close he had come to losing more than comfort. He wrapped the furs tighter around his shoulders, the scent now familiar, and watched her without speaking, unsure how to re-enter the space between them after what he had revealed in the night. Confession had altered the air, thinning the distance, and he sensed that whatever came next would not allow him to return to the numb anonymity he had carried north. She noticed him watching and met his gaze without surprise, as if she had been aware of his waking the moment it happened. "The storm is breaking," she said, her voice low, grounded, carrying the weight of observation rather than hope. Not gone, but it will let us move. She handed him a piece of dried meat and a cup of warm liquid, nourishment offered without ceremony, the kind that assumes acceptance rather than gratitude. As he ate, the reality of leaving pressed in on him, sharp and unsettling. The shelter had become more than refuge. It had been a pause, a place where something inside him had cracked open without collapsing. Outside waited decisions he had delayed for years, paths he had avoided because they required intention. He looked at Akaluk, at the ease with which she inhabited her own strength, and felt the uncomfortable pull of wanting to remain where choices felt simpler, defined by weather and daylight rather than memory. "You will not travel far today," she said, reading the tension in his posture as if it were written plainly. "The land will allow only short distances. You will follow me until the coast bends west, then you will decide." The way she said decide carried weight, stripping the word of its abstraction and anchoring it in physical consequence. Choice here was not philosophical, it was directional. They stepped outside together, the cold immediate but no longer violent, the air sharp enough to wake the senses without punishing them. The world had transformed under the storm's passing, snow sculpted into ridges and hollows that caught the light in muted blues and whites. The sky hung low, heavy with cloud, but there was movement in it now, a slow drifting that suggested change rather than threat. Eli followed Akaluk's lead, matching her pace, learning to place his feet where the snow would hold rather than betray him. She did not instruct him verbally. She showed him, trusting his ability to observe and adapt. With each step, he felt something unfamiliar take shape, a quiet confidence born not of mastery, but of attention. The land demanded presence, and in giving it, his mind had less room to spiral inward. They walked in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crunch of snow and the distant groan of shifting ice beneath the frozen sea. Eventually, the coastline emerged through the haze, a dark line where land met water, and Eli felt his chest tighten as the memory of his brother stirred again. This time, however, the ache did not consume him. It sat alongside the present moment rather than replacing it, and he realized that was new. Akaluk stopped where the ground sloped gently toward the shore and turned to face him fully. Up close, the wind traced fine lines across her face, and her eyes held the same steady clarity he had seen the night before. "Here," she said, planting her staff firmly in the snow, "is where my path turns north again." She studied him, not as a rescuer evaluating a burden, but as someone assessing an equal standing at a crossroads. Eli felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. The safety of following her was tangible, tempting, a continuation of shelter in motion. Going his own way meant stepping into uncertainty, armed only with what he had learned in a single night. He understood then that the land was offering him the same choice Akaluk had named before: stillness that led to fracture, or movement that risked pain but allowed endurance. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted, the honesty unguarded, stripped of self-pity. The words felt cleaner than the ones he had used in the past, less performative, more precise. "But I know I can't keep standing still." Akaluk's expression shifted, just slightly, the corners of her mouth tightening in something that was not quite a smile but carried its gravity. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating through their layers despite the cold. Her voice dropped, intimate but unwavering, as she spoke words that were not a claim of ownership but of recognition, a declaration of responsibility that cut through his fear. "You are mine now," she said, not as a promise to keep him, but as a truth he would carry with him. "Not because I saved you, because you survived and you chose to wake up." The words settled over him like the furs had the night before, heavy, protective, impossible to ignore. In them, he felt both the weight of connection and the freedom of being seen without being claimed. As she stepped back and turned toward her own path, Eli stood alone at the edge of the coast, the wind brushing past him with less force, the land waiting for his answer. Eli remained where Akaluk left him, long after her figure blended into the pale horizon and became indistinguishable from stone and snow. The land did not rush him. It never had. The wind moved around his body now rather than against it, tracing the outline of his shoulders, tugging lightly at the edges of his coat as if testing whether he would resist or yield. He realized then how different this moment felt from all the others in his life, where choices had been forced upon him by loss, accident, or fear. This time nothing pushed. The land waited. He turned slowly toward the coast, the sea stretching wide and muted under a sky still heavy with cloud, its surface fractured by slabs of ice drifting with quiet authority. The water no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a witness. Standing there, Eli understood that what haunted him had never been the moment his brother disappeared beneath the surface, but the years afterward when he refused to step fully back into the world. The cold had preserved that pain, kept it sharp and intact, but it had also protected him from confronting what came next. He adjusted his pack, feeling its weight settle more naturally against his back than it had before, and took his first step alone across the snow. The movement was small, almost unremarkable, but it carried intention, and intention changed everything. Each footfall pressed a brief mark into the surface before the wind softened its edges, a reminder that presence did not require permanence to matter. He found a rhythm quickly, guided by what Akaluk had shown him rather than by any map he carried. As the hours passed, the land unfolded with quiet generosity. The light shifted subtly, revealing contours and shadows he would have missed days earlier, and he noticed how his breathing stayed steady even as his muscles worked. When memories rose, and they did, uninvited and sharp, he did not fight them or chase them away. He let them exist alongside the sound of snow underfoot, the pull of cold air into his lungs, the distant murmur of ice grinding against ice. For the first time, grief did not demand all of him. Near midday, he paused at a rocky outcrop overlooking the water, its surface smoothed by generations of wind and freeze. He sat and removed his gloves, pressing his bare hands against the stone despite the cold, grounding himself in its solidity. He thought of Akaluk then, not as a savior or a myth, but as a woman who lived in dialogue with this place, who understood that survival was not about dominance, but relationship. Her words echoed again, not mystical, not theatrical, simply true. You are not finished. He spoke aloud without planning to, his voice carried away almost immediately by the wind. I'm still here, he said, not to the land, not to the sea, but to the memory he had kept buried. Saying it did not bring relief the way he had once hoped apologies might. Instead, it brought alignment. The statement fit his body the way a well-worn tool fits a hand. Imperfect, but honest. By the time the light began to fade again, Eli had reached a narrow inlet where the ice broke into channels of dark water, slow-moving and deliberate. He set up a temporary shelter using what Akaluk had taught him, every motion careful, efficient, stripped of hesitation. The fire he built caught quickly, its warmth spreading into the small space, and as he sat watching the flames, he felt something unfamiliar settle into him, not happiness, not closure, but steadiness. He understood then what she had meant when she said he was hers. It was not possession. It was lineage. He carried her teaching now, her way of seeing, just as he carried his brother's memory. Both shaped him, neither owned him. In the crackle of the fire and the quiet shifting of ice beyond it, Eli felt the weight of responsibility settle comfortably onto his shoulders. Not as a burden, but as proof that he belonged somewhere again, even if that place was defined by movement rather than walls. When sleep came, it did so without resistance. There were dreams, but they were gentler, less insistent, shaped by landscape rather than loss. He dreamed of walking along a frozen coast under a sky that slowly cleared, revealing stars sharp enough to cut, beautiful enough to demand attention. In the dream, he did not hurry. He did not look back in panic. He simply walked, aware of his breath, his body, the path forming beneath his feet. Far to the north, unseen and unannounced, Akaluk paused on her own journey and looked out across the land as if listening for something carried on the wind. She did not smile. She did not speak. She simply continued forward, certain that what had been set in motion would endure. And somewhere between ice and memory, Eli chose to keep moving, no longer running from the storm, no longer asking the past to release him, but carrying it with the care it deserved, alive, imperfect, and finally awake.